Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people feared bathing more than the plague, when garlic could double as perfume, and when your neighbor might literally throw strange things out the window and call it normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cleanliness is next to godliness, said absolutely no one in the 14th century. The fear of the full soak, why bathing became a bummer. Let's begin with a surprising fact. In the early Middle Ages, bathing was actually considered a good thing. Monasteries had bathhouses. Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing still lingered in some corners of Europe. But over time, particularly by the late medieval period, the idea of bathing shifted from healthy to hazardous. So what changed? In short, fear, superstition, and a wildly incorrect understanding of how the human body worked. People believed that hot water opened the pores, which they thought allowed illness to seep in. Imagine bathing during a plague outbreak and thinking, I've just turned myself into a sponge for death. That was the mindset. Bathing too often, they feared, could weaken your body and even invite disease. Water, in this worldview, wasn't cleansing. It was treacherous. It didn't help that bathhouses became morally suspicious. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many public bathhouses, once places of hygiene and even community, became social hubs with a rather scandalous reputation. Some operated like spas, others like brothels. Eventually, church leaders began to associate bathing with sin, which in medieval Europe was an excellent way to get things shut down. So instead of scrubbing down, many medieval folks just stopped bathing altogether. Not because they loved being dirty, but because staying dry was seen as safer, holier, and frankly more modest. After all, being naked was one thing. Being naked in hot water, that was practically inviting the devil in for a splash. This doesn't mean everyone wandered around like a mud-covered goblin. People still cleaned themselves in bits and pieces, washing hands, faces, and feet with cloths and herbal rinses. But the full-body soak became rare, reserved for the very wealthy, the dangerously brave, or the terminally itchy. So yes, medieval people feared bathing, but not because they were lazy or ignorant. They were trying in their own 14th century way to stay healthy. Unfortunately, without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or a basic grasp of microbiology, the strategy was more paranoia than prevention. The rise and fall of the medieval spa day, aka the public bathhouse. Once upon a time, in a town that didn't yet smell like horse manure and regret, the public bathhouse was a hub of hygiene, health, and mildly inappropriate social interaction. Inspired by lingering Roman influence, early medieval bathhouses offered warm water, communal tubs, and a hint of optimism. These were places where townsfolk could soak, steam, and chat like a medieval spa day, minus the cucumbers and scented candles. Monks, merchants, and even lower nobles used them. Cleanliness, for a brief moment in time, was both possible and fashionable. Then things got steamy in the worst way. By the 13th century, bathhouses had acquired a reputation for, let's say, multitasking. Bathing became less about cleanliness and more about companionship. Some bathhouses began offering extra services, with attendants who were suspiciously friendly and water that had seen far too many strangers. The line between wellness and wantonness blurred fast. It didn't take long for the church to get involved. Public nudity, even when paired with a loofah, was frowned upon. Sexual misconduct, even worse. Bathhouses became synonymous with sin, disease, and scandal. And once the Black Death rolled into town, people were more than happy to shut them down permanently. After all, you can't spread plague through a public tub if the tub's been boarded shut and declared morally compromised. But it wasn't just sin and sickness that doomed the bathhouse, it was suspicion. Over time, bathing itself began to seem indulgent, even dangerous. The very idea of soaking your body in warm water, especially with strangers, felt like a gateway to both physical and spiritual ruin, and so one by one, The bathhouses closed. Some were turned into bakeries, others were simply abandoned and left to rot. A poetic fate, really, for buildings meant to keep people clean. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks quietly lamented the loss. Many had maintained hygienic practices for centuries, including scheduled bathing, but now even that was in question. The church wasn't banning hygiene outright, just making it incredibly difficult to achieve. Thus began the golden age of dry cleaning, medieval style. Soap became optional, water became suspicious, and the bathhouse, just another relic of a time when scrubbing didn't come with consequences, when a full bath was a big deal or a bad idea. Despite the church's growing horror at naked elbows and the widespread belief that a hot bath could let the plague in through your pores, medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of bathing. They just turned it into something you'd do once a season, or when the smell became sentient. Let's begin with the nobles. Yes, wealthy people bathed, though not so often that their rubber ducks got wrinkly. They had servants lug in cauldrons of boiling water because indoor plumbing was still centuries away, pour it into a large wooden tub lined with a linen sheet, and sprinkle it with herbs like lavender, sage, or whatever was growing nearby that didn't smell like feet. This wasn't so much a bath as it was a soup you sat in. The bath was often prepared in the bedroom or near a fireplace, privacy optional depending on your level of power or shamelessness. Some even shared the tub with their spouse, because what's more romantic than floating in each other's filth like medieval fondue? The poor bathed too, but usually in rivers, barrels, or anything that held water and didn't bite. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about efficiency. Might as well wash the kid, the shirt, and the goat all at once, was probably said more than once. In winter, bathing took a backseat to survival, so instead of soap and water, people turned to a strategy known as pretend you're clean and just keep walking. A few urban bathhouses survived, particularly in southern Europe where warmer weather and better plumbing kept the dream of cleanliness alive. These were sometimes well run, with steam rooms and herbal treatments. Other times they doubled as venues for extracurricular activities not approved by the Vatican. Either way, you left refreshed, mildly steamed, and possibly slightly judged. For special occasions like childbirth or plague recovery, people would get proper baths because nothing says welcome to the world or please don't die like being dipped in a barrel of tepid rosemary water. The art of the medieval wipe down, aka the sponge bath, without the sponge. When full body immersion became suspect, thanks to the belief that hot water invited disease like an open bar, the medieval world turned to the next best thing, the humble sponge bath. Except they didn't really have sponges, at least not the soft, mass-produced kind you can buy at any modern store. Instead, they used linen cloths soaked in warm water, herbs, or vinegar, and wiped themselves down like they were trying to buff a stain off a very delicate chair. Hygiene in this context meant dabbing. If you were lucky, someone else did it for you. If you were noble, someone else did it reluctantly. These partial washes focused on hands, face, armpits, and occasionally the feet, the high-traffic areas, so to speak. Under layers of clothing, particularly linen shirts and shifts, helped absorb sweat and grime, meaning that changing your shirt regularly was about as close to modern hygiene as you were going to get. Your tunic may have been crusty, but your undershirt, fresh of course. Nobody was fooling themselves into thinking this was proper cleaning. But if water was limited, or if you believed a proper bath might invite the Black Death, this was the safe bet. And in a world without deodorant, toothpaste, or showers, a cloth soaked in rose water or vinegar was the medieval equivalent of a spa day, minus the spa, and really, minus the day. For wealthier folks, attendants might heat water, mix in herbs like rosemary or marjoram, and gently wash their master or mistress while pretending not to judge them. Peasants would boil water over a fire, then ladle it out into bowls and do the same, perhaps without the subtle judgment, but definitely with more draft. And if you were a monk, you probably had a better routine than most. Many monastic orders required scheduled washing, even if it was more spiritual than sanitary. Either way, the result was the same: a quick rub down, a whisper of moisture, and a renewed sense of being just clean enough to not scare the livestock. So no, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked, more or less. at least until you had to ride a horse for 6 hours through mud. Medieval hair, flammable but fragrant. If medieval hair had a motto, it would probably be flammable but fragrant. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't walk around with matted bird nests on their heads, at least not intentionally. They did in fact wash their hair, just not frequently, and certainly not with anything resembling shampoo. So what did they use? A variety of homebrewed concoctions that sounded like the first draft of a spellbook. One popular choice was lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, which was great for cutting through grease and also your scalp if used too often. Pair that with water of dubious quality, and you've got yourself a medieval chemical peel. For those hoping to preserve their follicles a little longer, egg yolks were sometimes used as a gentler cleanser, and yes, that meant sitting in a freezing hut with raw eggs sliding down your neck while trying to convince yourself this was nourishing. Others rinsed with beer, which if nothing else, made you smell like you'd had a wild night, even if you were just trying to remove lice. Some hair washing recipes included vinegar infusions with rosemary or lavender, which did double duty. They covered up other smells and gave the illusion of care. But let's be clear, no one was lathering up and rinsing twice. This was more of a targeted splash and squeeze operation. Water temperature also mattered. Hot water was believed to weaken the brain. Cold water could give you the plague. Lukewarm was the sweet spot, assuming you had fuel to heat it and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a bucket of bath water that your sibling hadn't already used. Brushing, on the other hand, was routine. Combs made of bone, wood or horn were common personal items, and often elaborately carved, a rare moment of elegance in an otherwise itchy reality, and people took pride in long, well-kept hair. Noble women in particular might spend hours getting their hair braided, coiled and veiled, all while hoping a nearby fireplace didn't undo their hard work with one rogue spark. Dental care. I still have most of my teeth. What's your excuse? Dental care in medieval Europe was less sparkling smile and more I still have most of my teeth. What's your excuse? Now, to their credit, medieval people didn't entirely ignore oral hygiene. They didn't exactly understand it either, but they made a solid effort using what they had, which was mostly cloth, charcoal, and blind hope. There were no toothbrushes. That innovation was still centuries away. Instead, people used linen rags to rub their teeth clean, ideally soaked in something abrasive like salt, crushed mint, or even burnt rosemary ash. The goal wasn't whitening, it was survival. If your breath didn't knock someone over, you were already winning. Some opted for chewing sticks, thin twigs from trees like hazel or elm, frayed at one end to create a brush-like effect. You chew until the fibers separated, then scrub your teeth. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush, organic, compostable, and weirdly bark-flavored. To freshen breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, depending on what they could afford or steal from the spice rack. In wealthier circles, you might rinse your mouth with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water, because nothing says dental sophistication like gargling a fluid also used to embalm pharaohs. And if you're wondering about toothpaste, it did sort of exist. Some recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash mixed with honey or oil to form a gritty paste. If your mouth didn't feel cleaner afterward, it at least felt sandblasted. Now, dentists, if you could call them that, were usually barbers on their off days. If a tooth was loose, infected, or just annoying, the solution was simple: yank it out. No anesthetic, no questions, just a wooden chair, a strong grip, and a few words to God. Aftercare included rinsing with wine and hoping your soul left your body before the infection set in. Despite all this, medieval people weren't necessarily toothless. Diets were lower in processed sugar, and many rural folks had better dental health than modern snackers. But when rot did set in, it set in fast, and the only toothpaste strong enough to fix it was divine intervention, the scent of the Middle Ages, more than just earthy. Let's be honest, if you time traveled to a bustling medieval town square, your first reaction wouldn't be awe, it would be gagging. Because medieval Europe smelled committed to being unforgettable. There was no sewage system, no deodorant, and very few functioning bathtubs, which meant the average street smelled like a combination of sweat, animals, rotting food, and optimism. If your nose survived a trip through the fish market, and past the tanner's shop. Congratulations, you'd already done better than most tourists. So how did people deal with this olfactory chaos? They got creative. Enter the pomander, a small hollow ball filled with herbs and spices, worn around the neck or tucked into clothing like a medieval Glade plug-in. These were stuffed with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or musk, and often dipped in ambergris, whale bath, but fancy, to make them smell pleasant. Think of it as carrying around your own portable air filter, only it didn't purify anything, just politely overpowered the filth. Ladies often wore scented sachets in their bodices, both to mask their own body odor and to ward off the smell of others. Some even braided herbs like rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair. It was equal parts hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control. For those with coin, perfume was imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet, extracted from the rear end of a very surprised cat-like animal. Applying it involved dabbing, waving, and pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of boiled turnips and regret. And then there were the environmental smells: open sewers, livestock, candle smoke, and whatever the local butcher had just flung into the street. Cities were often enveloped in a fog of funk, but no one really complained because everyone was in the same nasal nightmare together. It was communal suffering with notes of garlic. The church encouraged spiritual cleanliness, but physical scent was left largely to chance. If you smelled decent, people assumed you were rich or saintly. If you didn't, you were just blending in. Deodorant, the unsung hero that didn't exist. If you've ever forgotten to wear deodorant and spent the day nervously checking your armpits like a suspicious criminal, imagine doing that for your entire life, except no one had deodorant and everyone smelled like they'd been jousting in wool for 3 days straight. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where body odor wasn't just a possibility, it was an identity. There were no roll-ons, no sprays, and certainly no clinical strength aluminum-based antiperspirants. People simply sweated and then made peace with it, sort of. To mask or manage the musk, people employed various tricks. One common method was alumum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt that has mild antibacterial and astringent properties. It didn't stop sweat, but it could cut down on the stench, assuming you remembered to apply it and didn't mind grinding rocks into your pits. Others used chalk, vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular, not because they were effective, but because they smelled like something better than you. The logic was simple: if you can't stop the sweat, at least try to smell like a salad. In fact, perfumed handkerchiefs were all the rage among nobles, mostly so they could hold them under their noses while navigating crowded streets. No one wants to smell like medieval stew meat, but everyone did. The best you could do was smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medicine also played its part. Unfortunately, physicians believed sweating was a healthy way to purge bad humors, so blocking it was seen as suspicious, possibly even dangerous. You were expected to sweat, stink, and let the body cleanse itself. You weren't unclean, you were just medically fragrant. Then there was the fashion problem. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, and fur trapped heat and moisture like a mobile greenhouse. Combine that with open fires, feasting, and the occasional plague, and you had yourself a sensory experience worthy of a full-blown evacuation. But hey, you weren't alone. Everyone around you smelled. Even the king, even the priests, even the woman selling you radishes who hasn't bathed since Epiphany. In short, deodorant wasn't real, but shared suffering absolutely was. The humble hero: why medieval people loved linen. In a world without showers, soaps that didn't maim, or deodorant that didn't involve herbs stuffed into your armpit, medieval people turned to an unlikely hero in their hygiene routine: linen. Not to eat off of, but to wear, preferably close to the body, and changed before it grew legs. Linen undergarments were the unsung saviors of the Middle Ages. Breathable, absorbent, and surprisingly durable, they were worn beneath the heavier, more unwashable layers of wool and fur. Linen shirts, chemises, and shifts soaked up the sweat, grime, and everything else the body enthusiastically produced. In a world that celebrated moisture but misunderstood soap, the logic was elegant: wash the linen, not the person. Because scrubbing your own body was risky, see the plague, but scrubbing your shirt, perfectly safe. People might go weeks without bathing, but they would change their underlayer, sometimes even twice a week, which by medieval standards was practically saintly. Linen was so respected that it became a status signal. If your shirt was white and relatively clean, people assumed you had your life together. If it was grey, crusty and sprouting mold, well, you were either poor, possessed, or recently resurrected. For women, the linen shift was essential. It protected outer garments from sweat, and perhaps more importantly, from the smell of sweat. It was the medieval version of Febreze, only less chemical, and far more judgmental if not maintained. Knights wore linen under their armor to avoid turning into baked ham during tournaments. Monks wore it under their habits. Even peasants wore linen tunics, though usually patched, threadbare, and held together by sheer willpower. Of course, washing linen wasn't fun. It involved boiling water, lye, beating the fabric on rocks, and hoping the river didn't sweep it away. But it was still easier than bathing yourself or dealing with the spiritual consequences of baring your chest to a tub of warm water. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. The itch you couldn't scratch away. A bug's life in the Middle Ages. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. Not because people were allergic to linen or hay, though let's be honest, probably that too, but because they were constantly playing host to an entire traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were such an everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted roommates. You didn't get lice, you just had lice. Everyone did. Rich, poor, pious, drunk lice didn't discriminate. They were the true equalizers of medieval society. So what did people do? Well, for starters, they combed. Lice combs, often made of bone or wood, were common personal items like a toothbrush is today, except instead of polishing teeth, you were raking bugs off your scalp like some kind of tiny screaming orchard. These combs had fine, closely packed teeth, designed to pull out the critters, their eggs, and most of your patience. Another method, boiling clothes or baking them near the fire. The heat could kill the lice, assuming you didn't burn your only tunic in the process. This is also why you might see medieval illustrations of people holding up their shirts near a flame. It wasn't laundry day, it was pest execution. And then there was the classic technique of shaving one's head, particularly among monks or those who could get away with a bald look. Removing all hair was an effective if dramatic solution. Sometimes a wig was worn on top, which ironically could become its own lice hotel if not cleaned properly. Still, the logic was clear. No hair, no home for the vermin. Fleas were another problem, especially for those sleeping in straw mattresses or surrounded by animals. There weren't flea collars or bug sprays, only smoke fumigation and herbal sachets tossed between the sheets. Some believed certain smells repelled the pests, others probably just hoped the fleas moved on to someone smellier. But the real solution was endurance. Everyone itched, everyone scratched. It was part of life, like taxes, death, or stepping in something unspeakable near the market stalls. The medieval toilet, a study in creative improvisation. Ah, the medieval toilet. A term that feels wildly optimistic, because in truth, going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was less about comfort and more about creative improvisation and lowered expectations. Let's start with the elite. Castles had guardrobes, which were basically closets with a hole in a stone bench that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, and occasionally into an unfortunate patch of earth someone forgot to fence off. These were often located high up in towers for privacy and the added thrill of gravity. If you were below one, you learned quickly not to loiter. Peasants, on the other hand, had fewer luxuries. Most did their business outside, in the woods, near the river, or behind the barn. Some villages had communal pits, essentially outhouses with very low standards and even lower privacy. Your neighbor might be in there discussing crop yields mid-squat. For nighttime needs, chamber pots were the star of the show. These portable pots were tucked under beds or beside sleeping areas, ready to receive contributions in the dead of night. If you've never had the pleasure of relieving yourself into a cold ceramic bowl next to your sleeping family in the pitch dark, congratulations, you're not medieval. And what did they do with the contents of said pots? They threw them out the window, literally, with a hearty shout of Guard law. Watch out for the water. residents would dump their waste into the street below, ideally not hitting any passers-by. But let's face it, accuracy wasn't guaranteed. Street sanitation was handled mostly by gravity and pigs. Cities sometimes had gutters or central ditches to carry waste away, though these often clogged, overflowed, or just sat there fermenting into a neighborhood feature. Toilet paper? Not quite. People used rags, moss, straw, their hands, or, for the very refined, bits of wool or linen scraps. If that sounds unpleasant, imagine using snow in the winter, because they did. Public baths, from steam to scandal to shutdown. Before everyone collectively decided that bathing was suspicious and probably a sin, public bathhouses were actually thriving in medieval Europe. These weren't just tubs and soap, they were the social hotspots of their day. Think of them as medieval spas with a few extra plot twists. Bathhouses offered a variety of services: hot baths, steam rooms, massage, food, music, and depending on the establishment, the occasional questionable companionship. At their best, they were communal wellness centers. At their worst, they were bare-skinned dens of gossip, gluttony, and light scandal, and sometimes all three before noon. They were called stews, not because you sat in one too long, although you might, but because of the steamy water. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in places like Germany or Italy, where attitudes were a bit more relaxed. It wasn't always risque. Families could attend together, monks sometimes bathed in pairs, but human nature being what it is, boundaries got murky. So did the water. Naturally, this naturally made bathhouses a favorite target for the church. Clerics warned that bathing in mixed company led to sin, which, to be fair, it often did. Some bathhouses subtly became brothels with plumbing. The waters got hot, and not just from the fire beneath the tub. Then came the plagues, and everything changed. When diseases like the Black Death struck, bathhouses were blamed. Doctors believed open pores invited disease, and since warm baths opened pores, well, the math added up in a we don't know about germs sort of way. Bathhouses shut down, reputations tanked, and suddenly, the public bath was out permanently. Some regions held on to the tradition a bit longer. Southern Europe, the Middle East, and certain port cities kept their stews boiling for decades more. But in Northern and Central Europe, bathhouses began to vanish faster than your dignity after slipping into a communal tub. What remained was a mix of nostalgia and paranoia. Bathhouses had been warm, lively places, but they'd also become symbols of sin, disease, and damp decision-making. By the 1500s, the average person wasn't soaking with strangers anymore. They were dabbing at their armpits with vinegar and praying for the invention of soap that didn't smell like goat. Soap, the harsh reality of medieval suds. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like medicine at the time. Harsh, experimental, and likely to make you question your life choices. It technically worked, but using it felt more like punishment than self-care. The most common recipe: a hearty blend of animal fat and lye, or if you want to sound fancy, rendered tallow and wood ash. When combined, these ingredients created a substance that could strip dirt, oil, and possibly your soul from any surface. Early soap didn't come in pleasant pastel bars with ocean breeze scents. It came in coarse, waxy lumps that looked like something you'd avoid stepping in. To make it, you needed patience and a strong stomach. Boil down sheep or pig fat, stir in alkaline ash water, and wait while it hardened into blocks. If you added herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, you could convince yourself it was artisanal, but mostly it just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly used for laundry and heavy-duty scrubbing, not so much for the body, at least not casually. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn a bath into a mild chemical burn. Still, people used it when necessary, especially before special events like weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks. More refined soaps came from the Islamic world and southern Europe, particularly Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil instead of animal fat, and far gentler on the skin. These soaps were coveted luxury goods, traded across the Mediterranean, and reserved for people who didn't already smell like goat on a daily basis. But for most folks, soap was a utility, not a pleasure. You used it to wash your linens, your dishes, maybe your hands if they were really offensive. It wasn't part of a daily hygiene ritual. It was a monthly event, like taxes or a full moon. Some people went their whole lives with minimal soap exposure and considered themselves just fine, especially when surrounded by others doing exactly the same. Communal odor has a way of setting the bar low. Laundry day, a medieval marathon of muck and muscle. In medieval Europe, doing the laundry wasn't just a chore. It was a full-body workout, a community event, and a flirtation with frostbite. Forget laundromats or washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be willing to boil, beat, and beg the weather to cooperate. Most laundry was done in rivers, which sounds picturesque until you remember that these rivers also served as sewers, livestock baths, and the occasional body disposal site. But hey, running water is running water. First, you soaked your linens in lye or urine. Yes, actual human urine, collected in pots and stored until it reached peak potency, known as chamber lye. It was valued for its ammonia content, which helped lift stains and whiten fabric. The smell, less helpful. But in a time when perfume was optional and hygiene was interpretive, it did the trick. After soaking, clothes were dragged to the river, scrubbed against wooden boards or large flat stones, and then pounded with paddles, a method known as fulling. It was less gentle wash and more clothes interrogation. This process could take hours, and often involved the collective effort of washerwomen, who were both feared and admired for their arm strength. Then came the rinsing, and the wringing, and the drying, which if it rained, meant waiting another day and hoping your shirt didn't develop new sentience. Clothes were often spread across bushes, hedges, or stretched on lines between trees and peasant huts. Medieval villages had the charming aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. Of course, not everyone did their own laundry. Wealthy households had servants, monasteries had lay brothers, and some towns even had professional washers. But for most people, it was DIY or nothing. Interestingly, clean clothes were more important than clean bodies. You might not have bathed in a month, but if your linen shift was bright and fresh smelling, relatively speaking, you were considered presentable. In some cases, laundry was your hygiene. So did medieval hygiene actually work? Spoiler, sort of. After 14 chapters of scratching, scrubbing, sniffing, and surviving, the question must finally be asked, did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion? The short answer, it worked well enough. Not by modern standards, of course. If you were to time travel back to 1347, your nostrils would probably file for divorce. But in their own context, medieval folks weren't completely oblivious to cleanliness. They simply operated on a different scale of what counted as clean. They had systems, even if those systems involved vinegar foot soaks and chamber pots hurled out windows. They had tools, lice combs, linen layers, vinegar, herbs, ash-based soap. They had rituals too, whether it was sponge bathing before Sunday Mass or boiling one's underwear on a full moon. Hygiene existed. It was just deeply interwoven with fear, faith, and the weather. In many ways, medieval people were doing the best they could with what they had, while also constantly trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own armpits. The idea of regular full-body bathing was risky, time-consuming, and thanks to church doctrine and plague fears, seen as medically unwise, so they got inventive. And surprisingly, some practices aged well. Linen undergarments were hygienically smart, herb-infused water and vinegar rinses, pretty solid antibacterial logic. Even communal bathhouses were effective, until they turned into hot tubs of gossip and syphilis. But yes, people smelled, they scratched, they shared baths, lice, and deeply misinformed medical advice, yet many lived to see old age, or at least a second harvest, despite the hygiene horrors. So while their standards were, let's say, fluid, they weren't without effort. Hygiene was more of a social signal than a science. Clean clothes equaled virtue, shiny hair, or at least less itchy hair, meant discipline, and avoiding full-body rot was just good manners. In the end, medieval hygiene worked in the same way that balancing a wagon wheel with twine works. Barely, but impressively considering the tools, the ancients did it better. A brief aside to Mohenjo-Daro. Imagine walking through a city over 4,000 years old. the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you were expecting dusty huts and random alleyways, think again. This place was so well planned it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro wasn't thrown together like a festival campsite. It was meticulously organized. The city was laid out in a grid pattern. Yes, actual blocks and right angles. Streets ran north to south and east to west, intersecting cleanly and forming a neat network of roads. It was a marvel.